السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته الحمد لله حمدا شاكرين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. I pray all of you are well, in good health and in strong iman. This is Dr. Uthman Latiff, and this is on behalf of Sapiens Institute. We have a very important, inshallah, topic of discussion today, and I think all of us, inshallah, would be well prepared for this topic, because it's something that's in our perhaps collective memory, collective imagination, and that, of course, is the genocide of Srebrenica, the genocide of Bosnia from the years of 1992-1995. What we're going to do today, inshallah, is cover these kind of steps. So we're going to begin, inshallah, by speaking about what exactly happened during those very tragic years of the genocide in Bosnia. What were the causes for the insane violence meted out against peoples, particularly Muslims, but also other peoples as well. We're going to look at the constructs of othering and dehumanization that was a major role, in fact, in the motivations, in the ideologies, in the sentiments, in the psychology of the perpetrators of that genocide. We're going to look at the way that we understand the complexities, the subtleties of othering and dehumanization. And then we're going to look at the Islamic response to othering. What does Islam say about how do we deal with those constructs, in fact, as Muslims in our lives? And so therefore that's on the agenda, inshallah. Today I pray Allah puts barakah in our studies together. And here we go, therefore, from the beginning. The genocide of Muslims in Bosnia in 1995. To begin with, following the falling apart of the Soviet Union, there was, of course, a breakup of countries. So therefore, that was something that maybe we wouldn't remember. It depends, of course, how old we are. People tend to think of Soviet Union as simply Russia nowadays, but Soviet Union was something quite different at that time. We have these smaller countries, the breakup of Yugoslavia, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, that when the Soviet Union broke up, partly because of the failure of its occupation of Afghanistan, these countries sought independence from the Yugoslav Republic. And so the Serbs, therefore, employed in their attempt to push back and fight against Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia, an extreme form of nationalism, in ethnocentrism, in their attacks against the Slovenians, Croatians, and then, of course, the Muslim Bosnians as well. And so after the breakup of Yugoslavia, there emerged a kind of insane, incensed type of violence carried out by military organizations, paramilitary organizations. But not just that, also the average man, in fact, was taking arms against his fellow neighbor, his fellow teacher. And this, in fact, is quite common sometimes because we talk about genocide is a mass killing, a kind of upsurge of violence meted out against peoples. So what you find, therefore, happening from the Yugoslavia against the Muslims of Bosnia, from the Serbs, in common people, in the average person, not necessarily attached to the military, but because there is an entrenched form of loyalty seeking, loyalty adhering to, that's going to create binaries which become ossified and entrenched in those times. And that happens, of course, with the time of the Nazis, happened very much in time of Rwanda. This is very much covered in my book on Being Human as well. And so the aim was to ethnically cleanse the area of Muslims. Here we have locations in 1992. Prijedor, for example, over 3,000 non-Serb civilians were killed. In Visegrad, 3,000 Bosnian Muslims were killed, burnt alive, mass rapes. In fact, rape became a weapon of war. Concentration camps were set up, Zvornik, Vesina, and Tuzla as well. So therefore, these are locations where great injustices were taking place against the Muslim population and also other people as well, including some Christians as well. But here we have an ethnic conflict being played out and ethnic cleansing taking place. Now, the strategy was to erase Bosnian Muslims lives, heritage, and identity. What does that mean? So we can understand what it means to erase Muslim lives, as in to exterminate a people, to kill people. But then you have with that the extermination of heritage and identity. So it's not only about the physical presence of the Muslims being annihilated and, annulled and becomes absent, but the heritage identity of a people. So this is quite similar, in fact, to what you find in settler colonialism, particularly in Palestine, for example. It wasn't so much only about ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from 1948 Nakba onward, in fact, even from 1947. But then when you had those Palestinian Muslims who were displaced by force into other places, in the Lebanon, for example, or Syria, the locations where inhabitants used to once live now become other sites of other things. So sometimes the sites, the landscapes, homes, farmlands were transformed into city parks, sometimes into forests, even car parks. And so the destruction of lives and heritage and identity. So removing, therefore, the identity of the Bosnian Muslim as if they didn't live there ever in the first place. And so therefore you find, therefore, the transforming, the changing of names, the refusal to have burial sites, plaques of remembrance, and so on and so forth. So Serb militants led by General Ratko Mladic entered the eastern town of Srebrenica after it was declared a UN safe zone, protected, they said, by a lightly armed Dutch peacekeeping force of around 600 troops commissioned by the UN. And so therefore, the Bosnian Muslims were supposed to be protected by the UN, but they were deemed themselves incapable, unwilling, or complicit. And so therefore, the UN sanctioned Serb militants to enter the demilitarized safe haven, embarked on premeditated mass murder aided by the international community's indifference, meaning not that they were active participants, perpetrators themselves, no, but because they were supposed to be a peacekeeping force, then of course the inhabitants, the subordinated ones, in this case the victims, the Muslim Bosnians, would have felt as if they were safely, protected by those peacekeeping forces, but then to be abandoned by them, of course, is here indicated. Over 5 days, 8,300 Muslim men and boys were massacred by Bosnian Serb military forces. This is now the genocide in Srebrenica. So just think, therefore, this is the worst human, atrocity committed, as in war crime, as in ethnic cleansing, as in genocide since the Second World War. More than 8,000 Muslim men and boys massacred in Europe over 5 days. Around 50,000 women and girls were raped in those 5 days. One of the worst cases of ethnic cleansing and worst massacre in Europe since the Second World War. Now, it's important for us, therefore, if we go back and look at the history behind this, understanding, therefore, the context, understanding the motivations of the perpetrators, understanding the political dimensions with the breakup of Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, and then, of course, the violence that takes place off of the back of that. So entrenched forms of extreme nationalism, become apparent. And what this does is it creates or it ossifies self and otherness constructs. And so when people feel that they have a sense of belonging in this case to their own ethnicities, then the others, of course, become the ones who don't simply belong to their own identities, or those who are different in small ways or in big ways, but they would always be the existential others. And this is something we're going to talk about, and it exists in all forms of life and living, in fact, in our worlds today. But if it's unchecked, then it can lead to and result in the worst examples of it in human history, which of course would be genocides, as what happened to the Muslims here in Bosnia. And so therefore we've seen the upsurge of violence after the breakup of Yugoslavia, the beginning of killing sprees, 3,000 killed, 3,000 kills there, burning alive, burning homes alive. So so kind of trapping Muslims and then locking, barricading them, and then burning those houses so that the people inside them are burnt alive. Mass rapes as a weapon of war, concentration camps, and then the strategy was therefore to erase, Bosnian Muslims' life, heritage, identity, from that landscape. Now, why is it important for us to remember? Now, on July the 11th, they would have, of course, the Remembrance Day for the genocide of Srebrenica. And this is something that happens every single year as a form of remembrance. Why is it important for us to remember this? Because remember that the people that we're talking about are not just numbers. They're more than just numbers. We can easily become desensitized if we're always thinking about numbers. We can have a sense of a media fatigue or compassion fatigue even. We can become fatigued of always exhibiting compassion because there's too many people to show compassion towards, and we become fatigued by that. Stanley Cohen, in his book States of Denial, talks about that, discusses that phenomenon. Or media fatigue, if we're having the same images played out again and again and again, it could lead to a sense of media fatigue because you're fatigued of seeing the same images again and again. But then that's the tragedy of becoming desensitized, therefore, to to that tragedy. To kind of rise above that and realize that the people that are being spoken of are not just numbers, but are actually people, human beings. They all had families, right? They all had families. Every one of them would have had a father or a mother, right? Or would have been a father and would have been a mother, siblings, children, uncles, aunts, grandfathers, neighbors, teachers, students. All had these relationships which gave them a sense of belonging, place, importance in human society. They all had careers. They would have had careers, or would have been career-seeking people, would have hoped to have a career. They had dreams and aspiration. This is something that we call, these are human codes of recognizability. So therefore, when we think about empathy, empathy is built in many ways because not only when we see differences in people, but also when we see things that are just patently similar between us and them, right? It's when we deny those points of similarity and only focus on differences where we begin to think, where we're, the sentiments or the ideas of othering or otherness, might creep in. And every single person's death, of course, matters. And so therefore, that's a key thing for us to remember. They're not just numbers. They all had families, all had careers, or they had careers, or they were career seeking, or their parents had careers, or they had dreams and aspirations. And every single person's death, of course, matters. Think about why it's important for us to remember lives, memories, places, and spaces. What makes us, in fact, what makes us living and human beings. We have lives and we have memories. And so within lives, of course, memories are created. What gives our lives meaning in many cases, or importance, or happiness, or even sadness, but what kind of represents the completion, really, I guess, of living, is the fact that we're going to have a whole host of memories that we recall, that we have nostalgia, we hearken back to, we reflect on these points of remembering ourselves and our places and our spaces. It's a remarkable book that I discuss, in fact, in my book here on Being Human, called Khirbet Kizeh. Khirbet Kizeh was authored by S. Yizhar, which is in fact it's a pen name, an anonymous author. He authored this book in around 1965, I think it was, and the book, in fact, is an historicized fiction on the Nakba of 1948. And what he does is he speaks about these, and of course he's against the atrocities of what happened by the settler colonizers, but he speaks about the fact that I remember he says that when these soldiers come into these new homes where there were people who lived, and the furnishings in the homes are a proof of the fact that other people used to live here once upon a time, and they've just been forcibly removed. And he uses these words, and he says, how will they feel when the walls begin to scream in their silence, right? Because other people lived here It's here that love was made. It's here that love was unmade, broken. It's here that tears were shed. It's here that, people laughed. People celebrated together. Memories were made in these sites, in these places, right? So in lives, therefore, we have memories, right? That's what kind of keeps us going in life. We have these memories that we harken back to. We think, we reflect on places and spaces, and places and spaces, of course, are crucial here. I remember when I was in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and we were doing the tour of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and we were speaking about the fact that the places and the spaces, in fact, of Auschwitz-Birkenau, there is a remarkable set of, there's in some of the walls, the memorial walls in Birkenau, they have these portraits, stretched out against the walls. And the victims of the Holocaust, their portraits are all together. And when I thought about it, and I wrote about it again in both of my more recent books, I spoke about the juxtaposition between what the Nazis sought to create in that place and space of otherness, and within the constructs of otherness, then would be separation, would be isolation, would be a lack of, meaning a denial of togetherness, because togetherness creates empathy, creates love, and so on and so forth. But it's so tragically ironic that now on those same walls, the portraits of these victims are all together. And I just had this sense of feeling that how tragically ironic that is, in juxtaposition that is, that in that same place and space, these two constructs are created, but it's created, of course, through time, because time has lapsed, and now, of course, there are different dynamics and different actors and so on and so forth. Other things are happening. In this, therefore, the idea of remembering the tragedy within our lives, memories, places, and spaces. Remember that most were killed with bullets or grenades in fields, warehouses, and football pitches. Bulldozers were used to bury bodies in mass graves, which were then moved to try to hide evidence of the genocide. Therefore, that makes it even more imperative on us to remember the victims of that genocide, because there was a deliberate effort on the part of the perpetrators to hide the crimes, to hide the massacres. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, if you're traveling from Krakow to Birkenau, you're going to pass through a village called Oswiecim. And we were told, in fact, that Oswiecim, which is kind of en route to Birkenau from Krakow, used to be a hub of industry in the time of the Nazis. And we were told, therefore, that it was kind of like a buffer. It was kind of a way of creating a mental buffer, for the people at that time, so that they wouldn't think that Auschwitz-Birkenau is a place of horrors, if just next to that town, adjacent to that town, to Birkenau, Auschwitz, is of course Oswiecim, where there's so much happening of civilization and industry and happiness and so on and so forth. Meaning we can't see, therefore, the horrors taking place, because it's a deliberate effort to hide those crimes. Again, the point I made about 1948 Nakba, it was the same policy, right? So therefore, the way that you would hide the displacement is by building over the sites with city parks, or car parks, forests. And so when that takes place, therefore, that people wouldn't think that anybody used to live here before. Now, today, for example, in West Jerusalem, you have the big memorial museum called Vad Shem, which is the biggest memorial museum about the tragedy of the Holocaust. But 1 mile away from Vad Shem, in fact, is the site of the Deir Yassin massacre of April 1948. And that's one of the worst massacres that took place, when you had the rise of the Stern Gang and the Urgan and these militia. But the point is that in that 1 mile distance where the site of that massacre took place, there is no memorial, and there are no plaques of remembrance, and there are no graves, and there are no names of the victims. So the tragedy, therefore, that loss of life, that killing, is all hidden, but it makes it more incumbent upon us, therefore, to remember that, because we have an obligation as human beings to unearth the tragedies and to reflect and to to mourn the loss of life, but not just to do that, but also to think about how we're going to prevent this happening again, by knowing, of course, that it happened once before in the first place. And so many bodies were spread across multiple mass graves, and nearly 2 decades on, remains are still being uncovered, therefore, in Bosnia. Now, remember also that this genocide was the greatest atrocity on European soil since the Holocaust, but it's rarely mentioned in any history lesson. When is the last time you heard about that in a history lesson? Even though, of course, it's Europe. The demographics, of course, is Europe. But we tend not to hear about it a lot in schools, for example, unless it's in rare cases, if people are studying, genocide or something like that, but they probably wouldn't be studying it in school anyway. But just think about that, the greatest atrocity on European soil since the Holocaust, but it's rarely mentioned in any history lessons. Why should it be remembered? Because since rape was a weapon of war, 50,000 women and girls raped in those days, that leaves behind, until today, an indescribable trauma, from not just the victims, but the descendants of those victims, right? To know that that's kind of part of their conscious state, their consciousness now, to know, of course, that that's their legacy. I mean, that's not their legacy, but that's what they've been subjected to, that, of course, has molded and shaped them, influenced them to become what they are in the situation now. But just to think about, therefore, that the indescribable trauma that leaves, that makes it more of an obligation upon us. The civil war in Liberia in the 1990s was a war also where rape was used as a weapon of war. So you had these young girls, and you had mass rape in the 1990s in Liberia. But there was a lack of media attention towards that suffering, until, of course, you had the great efforts of Lima Gabawi, the Christian, and you also had the Muslim. I forgot the lady's name, but they had this kind of a partnership between them. And so Lima Gabawi would bring out the women from the churches, and other one would call upon the imams to come out from the mosque, and they used the radio as well as the platform. And then they would dress all in white, and then they would sit in the street. They would sit on the roads, right, as a form of protest. So for people to take notice of what's happening, until the media from Western countries became involved in that. But the whole point is, therefore, that for them, of course, Lima Gabawi has a very famous line and says that I'm doing what I'm doing because I don't want that my daughter says to me later on, Mama, what was your role during this crisis, right? And of course, that's a daughter, and that's a mother. And there's, of course, some, in a sense of affinity in that respect, when you have a rape as a weapon of war. Point number 3, never again Auschwitz, of course, is a very famous kind of declarative. Never again Auschwitz, meaning Auschwitz should never happen ever again. And of course, the point is very true. Theodor Adorno here, in his article entitled Education After Auschwitz, published a few decades after Auschwitz, he has an opening line. In fact, in his article, he says that the premier demand upon all education is never again Auschwitz. He says, therefore, the premier demand upon all education, for mentors, for teachers, for educators, is never again Auschwitz. In fact, his whole premise and point is to outline, for primarily the German people, new ways of teaching, of reteaching empathy for those people, because he believed, therefore, there were some things that acted to facilitate the genocide against the Jews, and other things just simply made it easier for the Nazis to do that. One, he believed, therefore, there was a kind of an ideological hardness in the German people, in that they were used to obedience to authority. And so when the Nazis came into power, it was simply, therefore, another form of authority that they had to obey. But the other one, therefore, he outlined is a lack of empathy, meaning there was a lack of attention from parents, principally mothers, teaching their children the importance of empathy, and therefore he believed this was one of the reasons why why something like that could not necessarily take place, but that when genocidal tendencies begin to emerge in society, perhaps there is a lack of ability in pushing back against those tendencies. And that's his article. Interestingly, Henry Giroux wrote an article in more recent times called Education After Abu Ghraib, in fact, taking therefore the idea behind Adorno's analysis and saying, well, what about if the state is not necessarily Nazism in this case, but it's American exceptionalism or American hubris acting out its atrocities against another people who it otherizes and dehumanizes, in this case, the Iraqi people. Even today, public knowledge of the genocide is extremely limited, right? Extremely limited, right? We don't have that same attention that we might have towards other examples of mass killing when it comes to, therefore, to the genocide of Bosnia. It's important for us to raise awareness of the genocide to help work towards a rejection of the hatred and Islamophobia. And that's therefore why, of course, we should be remembering it. So we can use it, of course, as a point of study, as a point of discussion, as a point of raising awareness about the hate that emerged in society at that time, the Islamophobia, the genocidal tendencies. And there is really nothing more Islamophobic than genocide itself. All right. So therefore, we've covered so far the history, the political context behind the genocide, the importance of remembering the genocide and its victims as well. And now we come to our third point, which is othering, understanding what othering actually is. What is othering? Now, othering is the relegating of another to a marginalized place. So all of us, of course, we have a sense of self about us. We see ourselves as who we are, as whoever we are, however you identify yourself, but that's what you give yourself. You give yourself a sense of self-appreciation, self-awareness, a sense of self-autonomy, perhaps. You give your own sense of self, its position, its place in society, and people recognize you for your sense of self. And that's fine, because we all see ourselves as ourselves. The other is the one who we don't believe has the same or should be afforded the same rights and values as we afford to ourselves or to those that we love and respect. Okay, it is a seeing in the other much less than sometimes a complete absence of what one sees in oneself, right? So however you see yourself is intrinsic to this whole discussion, because whatever you see of yourself, if you see of yourself something that is so much of something without being specific, then you might never be able to see the other outside of you being entitled to or worthy of that thing. It's very interesting. The Prophet Muhammad said in the hadith, انظروا إلى من أسفل منكم ولا تنظروا إلى من هو فوقكم, that look to those who are under you, have less than, not to those who have more than you, because then you would undermine Allah's favor upon you. Meaning, be conscious of the way that you're seeing yourself in the first place, because that's going to have a very big bearing on how you're going to see somebody else, meaning the other outside of you. The Prophet taught us to say, when we see ourselves in the mirror, that we say, Allahumma ahsin khuluqi kama ahsanta khalqi. Now this again is very important in terms of self-appreciation. Oh Allah, make my character beautiful the way that you've made my form, my outer form, beautiful. Because if we're only carrying our outer form as a representation of the trueness or the fullness of ourself, then it's a problem, because we're going to pay less attention to the thing that is overriding that, the thing that is more consequential, the thing that is has more of a bearing, in fact, on who we're going to be remembered as being and how we're going to treat others. And that's going to be the heart of a person, his character, and so on and so forth. So all that is morally reprehensible can sometimes be defined in that other. In the essence, what it is that the thing that are morally reprehensible in yourself, we tend to impute on that other, right? So therefore, there's a kind of a one is perfect and the other is lacking all perfection. Othering is othering is a construct of dehumanization. All right. So, and these, of course, are constructs together: dehumanization and othering. So, othering again still is number one, a negating of another's individual and social worth, right? To deny another person as having, intrinsic worth, social worth, meaning if social worth is like that person cannot fit into a social identity model. That person can't fit into a social grouping that's worthy. That person can't fit into a kind of a social framework that's deemed to be worthy. In the time of the Holocaust, we call that social death and social dying. So before even Hitler came to power in 1933, there was the beginning of social death and social dying of the Jewish people, to be ostracized, to be castigated, to be separated from the others, meaning that you're going to become now ghettoized people. And that's exactly what happened. So in the Warsaw Ghetto, even Palestinians, for example, in the othering that they're subjected to, are seen to be, uneducated or ghettoized people. And this, in fact, only stems from the idea that one, people have afforded themselves a sense of individual place and individual importance, a sense of being in their place and spaces, and the others are not afforded that same sense of individuality, because everything becomes generalized, and nor are they given a sense of social worth. But instead, what tends to happen is a social dying, a social death of those people, meaning even before anybody commits an act of physical abuse or killing of those people are becoming non-entities in people's imagination, in people's minds. Othering is in grouping and outgrouping. And so when these things take place, as in the example of Bosnia, where you have a very extreme forms of nationalism, and ethnic kind of solidarity between groups, it's going to mean, therefore, that the in-group, in this case, the Serbs and their attempts to take over from Slovenia or Croatia or Muslim Bosnia, would, of course, herald themselves as being worthy, or herald themselves as being superior in their in groups, and then the others belong to the out groups, and the out groups are distant, not only physically distant, but also culturally different as well. Culturally distant as well. So physically distant and culturally distant as well. It doesn't mean for cultural distance to exist that a people have to be physically distant. It doesn't mean that. But what it means is that there's so much of a sense of generalizing around those people, or a sense of castigating or a vilification of those people, that the sense of closeness between one people and another is compromised. That sense of closeness is now stretched far and wide. So in people's mental imaginations, they don't see those people as belonging to them. Therefore, they're outcasts. They're outcasts, they're outgrouped. Number three, marginalization. Therefore, to deny a people a sense of place and belonging that you deem to be worthy for yourself means, of course, that people are going to become marginalized. In a very famous poem called "Nothing's Changed" about the South African apartheid, I remember the lines of the poet, who said that the narrator is speaking, and he's, of course, a Black African, and he's troubled, of course, as he would be, by the South African apartheid. That he speaks about an area called District 6. He says, no sign says it is, but we know where we belong. So no sign says it is, but we know where we belong, right? So in one area, you're going to have the wealthy whites dining and eating in fancy restaurants, but in his area, where he and his people have become ghettoized and marginalized, he says, and the words he uses are, over there, he says, eat it on a plastic table's top, spit a little on the floor, meaning, and you can hear the consonants of the T, which kind of reflects the sense of disgruntlement, in the tone of voice there. He says, take it with you, eat it at a plastic table's top, spit a little on the floor, meaning it's all quite rough. It's all quite rough, and it's all quite kind of downgraded in those areas. And that's because of marginalizing those people and then generalizing them. And so to dehumanize and to otherize means that you do not afford those people a sense of individuality, an individual person, an individual character, that a person is who he is because of his own merits, of his own traditions, of his own beliefs, of his own values, of his own life and living and own memories. But we tend to generalize them, that they're all the same, right? That if one people are in people's eyes seen as the other, it means everybody who is in that same space of existence, that same society or that same land, or of that same complexion or of that same ethnicity, are all the same. Generalize them, right? And that's exactly what happens with othering, to generalize people. And you can probably, notice, I mean, in your own readings, I remember when I was in school and we would read Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, the way that Macomb County, of course, had generalized black people at that time. And so when what's his name? Is it Tom Robinson, the one who was convicted of a crime he didn't commit against Mayor Ewell, when he is now castigated for being this horrendous criminal and dehumanizing people's minds, it's all black people in Macomb County, in fact, who are tarnished by this bad reputation because of generalizing in them. And it's interesting how Harper Lee therefore seeks to push back against that, because Atticus Finch, who is the white lawyer, then defends, of course, Tom Robinson. I think his name is Tom Robinson, isn't it? And so therefore the idea is a way of kind of showing us an offsetting against the tendencies of generalizing, because Atticus Finch is a white person defending, of course, a black person, and then the other one, of course, is Boo Radley. And Boo Radley, I remember, he's a mockingbird, because a mockingbird has no song of its own; it copies the song of the jaybird, and so that's what happens if people are generalized. They have no voice. They have no voice of their own. Boo Radley, interestingly enough, of course, is the one who is also marginalized. Not generalized in the sense, because he is quite an aloof person, individual in his strangeness, and aloof. But it's interesting that even though people have these suspicions of him, he ends up saving, the life of one of the key characters. And so the idea is therefore that generalizing is what really leads to, or is a consequence of othering. Othering can be based on anything, really. A disability. You might see handicapped people or wheelchair-bound people as so removed from your own sense of social, living, that you have not ever kept in company with a person on a wheelchair or handicapped, that they haven't lived near you, like physically and mentally and spiritually, that you can't see them as ever occupying that same space as you. Therefore, the disabled could become othered in the sense that they're just too far away physically, far away culturally, to be included in my own space. Think about race. Race is an obvious one. And so there's just so much about race and racism, and othering and dehumanization, and it's a lot to be spoken of here. I have an article and also a sermon I've delivered before on Sapiens Institute website called "I Can't Breathe," and this, of course, following the tragic killing and murder of George Floyd, and then before him of Eric Garner and so many others as well, whose final words were "I can't breathe." But race, of course, has a big bearing here, and it's so interesting. In fact, well, it's not interesting, but it's haunting in a sense that the Bosnian, the Serbian perpetrators of the genocide disallowed the Bosnian Muslims an ethnic identity. And they said that these people are not really Slovak people, that they're Turks. And so they use the defaming label of Turks or dirty Turks as a way of excluding them from the ethnicity to which they belonged. And so therefore it's creating an out group, because the in group are the only ones, in this case the Serbs and not other Slovak people. Ethnicity, of course, this of course was a case of ethnic cleansing, and so we're speaking about that. Socio-economic status and so many others as well. Socioeconomic status, the last one here, socioeconomic status. There's a very famous poem called Tramp by Zulfikar Ghosh, if I remember. And in that poem, the poet speaks about a father and a son who notice a beggar on the streets, and that beggar, and it describes, if I remember, it describes the father saying that we cross paths, but our eyes, what did he say? That our eyes deliberately avoid the glance of looking upon one another, meaning we deliberately have a way of avoiding coming into close proximity to him by simply not looking at him, but looking through him and past him. And he says that beggar, he has he's wearing a dirty jacket, or he has he's unkempt, and he ends the poem by saying that no place for him in our heaven, there is clean and empty. And that's a kind of a good kind of striking point there, in the sense that the heaven that he's speaking about is the heaven of their own social spacing, right? So their own society. That, of course, is heaven, is for the dispossessed person, the beggar, the homeless person. That's like the heaven. But he says that in our heaven it's clean and it's empty. Clean you might understand, but empty is interesting, because the idea is that if we disallow people of other socioeconomic statuses, poorer people perhaps, into our own spaces, our own worlds, our own sense of living, then we're going to live very lonely lives, because most people, if we're speaking about the poor and the wealthy, most people are not going to be wealthy. Most people are going to be of the ones struggling, and so on and so forth. But othering can take place in each of these, and in so many others as well. Now, a bit of a historical othering. So we've spoken about, therefore, what othering is, types of othering. Now, what about the historical othering that made the genocide in Bosnia, so real? Now, in the Spanish Inquisition during the 16th century, Muslims were depicted as Saracens, Hagarenes, and Hagarene beasts. Now, just a bit about Spanish Inquisition. Remember that the genesis of the Crusades that took place in the 11th century did not begin in Clermont in France when Pope Urban II made his proclamation in 1095. The genesis of the Crusades, in fact, begin in Al-Andalus, in Islamic Spain. And this happens when the Muslims become divided into the Muluk al-Tawa'if, into the party kingdoms. And when this happens, they lose their major states, of Toledo and Seville and Cordoba and the smaller states, and they become like just dozens of small independent states. When this happens, the Catholic popes, Alexander III, Gregory VII, they call for what came to be known as a crusade, because they granted indulgences to the participants for these Spanish crusaders to go and fight against these Muslim party kingdoms to recapture some states that they took from the Christians. But the point is that the idea of the Crusades was, in fact, from that point onwards, right? Because that's when the indulgence was granted, the remission of sins was granted. And then after that, you had, after Gregory VII, you had then, who in fact was one of the mentors of Urban II, who then pronounced his crusade in 1095. And then they came in 1099 and they took Jerusalem from the Muslims. But again, the language of dehumanization is very, very powerful in the surviving accounts of Pope Urban II's letters. But the Spanish Inquisition, which happened later than in Spain, from the 15th and 16th centuries, Muslims were depicted as Saracens, Hagarenes as in the wife of Ibrahim alayhi salam, Hajar, and that's of course it's Ismail alayhi salam who comes from Hajar, and then Ishaq comes from Sarah, Ibrahim's wife, but called Hagarenes as in they're othered, as in they're different, as in they're not the same as us. And Hagarene beasts, and beasts of course is very typical in the language of dehumanization, because a beast means in fact a beast is a non-human. You have dehumanizing as in subhuman entities, but a beast is an animal. And a beast is not just a beast, is a wild animal. A beast is an animal that you would fear. A beast is an animal that should be kept far from you. In the 16th century, Habsburg Empire, Muslim Turks were portrayed as terrible Turk. Spaniards described the Moors as greedy and sadistic. And in Bosnia, interestingly, they said, you're not really ethnic Slavic people, but Turks. Right? So it's hearkening back, therefore, to that old, very old, dehumanizing of labels and castigating and othering of Turkish people, from centuries before, in Muslim interaction, sometimes conflict with people, but that's the image being built up and created in the minds of these Europeans towards Muslims. In official documents, the Moriscos were routinely referred to as pestilence. Moriscos were the ones who, following the Inquisition and the rise of the Grand Inquisitors like Tomasito Camada and Talavera and the other ones, it became, the Muslims were unable, therefore, to remain as Muslims because Islam was a banned religion, Arabic was banned. Muslims were forced to eat pork and drink wine and were unable to say the word Allah or to pray or anything like that. This was the terrible dark days of the Inquisition. And the Moriscos and the Moriscas were the ones who held out, holding on to their faith in such difficult situations. And then, of course, there was the big fatwa of Ahmad ibn Bujuma, the fatwa of Iran, where he gave license for them to hold their faith in secrecy. Outwardly, they would look like Christians, but inwardly they would be Muslims, and they would pray in secret, and so on and so forth. But they're referred to as pestilence, plague, a fever, pestilential horde, beasts, vipers within the bosom of Spain. And if you think about, when you think about these words, you think about an infestation, and everybody knows that infestation has to be, removed, for the safety of the people. You have to remove what's infesting, and therefore, by calling them these kind of words, a plague, a fever, beasts, vipers, pestilence, it gives that impression. Now, this was a kind of language used in polemical texts, in fact, in texts written in support of the expulsion of the Muslims. One of them, for example, a former preacher in Valencia, Fonseca, wrote how the treason and bad customs of the Moriscos were inherited in their corrupted blood and their mothers. What is that? I can't see that. And their mother's milk, right? And their mother's milk. Look at that, right? So it's so tragic, therefore, and it's so tragically ironic, actually, because the whole, the Moriscos, in fact, were also native. These are not Arabs. These are converts, to Islam over centuries, right? So they're actually Spanish. They're Spanish, just as Spanish as the Catholics. And they're native inhabitants who had embraced Islam hundreds of years ago. And then they only knew, of course, Islam as a religion. They only knew Arabic as a language And this is why when you had the banning of Arabic language, they put up a fight. They had to pay 50,000 ducados, to have that suspended for 50 years, and it was. But the ones who were speaking are native inhabitants, are Spaniards, right? And so to say, therefore, that they were inherited in their corrupted blood and their mother's milk, it gives the impression that these people are different in all ways. But you wouldn't get the impression that they're speaking about people who look like them, right? Who just like them ethnically and everything else. All right, so that's some historical othering behind the European context there. Now, here we have, so in one horrifying case which reflects the extent of othering as a process to legitimize violence is the siege of Sarajevo. The state-run Belgrade TV aired a false story intended to fuel hatred and justify the siege, including the line, Muslim extremists have come up with the most horrifying way in the world of torturing people. Last night, they fed the Serb children to the lions in the city's Pionirska's Dolinos Zoo. Now, of course, this is complete fabrication. This is complete nonsense, and nothing like this ever happened. But the fact that story could be run, on Belgrade TV and reached millions of people, meant, of course, that an impression of those Muslims would have been built up, right? So the fact that it's reflecting something so savage as in feeding children to wild animals in the zoo is something so savage that they're going to have this impression built. Now, this, of course, stems from ignorance. Ignorance, of course, is the root of all problems. And in fact, Urban II, when he's proclaiming his crusade, what came to be known as crusade, to those people in France, in Clermont and other places, he's speaking many of his audience members, in fact, are going to be brigands and thieves and rapists and murderers, as well as, of course, monks and more upright knights. But he's speaking to people who want a chance of remission of sins and redemption. This is why he's speaking to them, as appealing to them. But he's using a language of dehumanizing of Muslims. He says that Muslims are heathen people. Muslims worship a man called Muhammad. Muslims sacrifice babies at the altars. Crazy things that you would never imagine of. But when they're hearing these stories, it's building up an image in their minds that people are just so horrific and so sadistic that they have to be fought against. So therefore, we can, save ourselves from them as well. Here's another one. So this is from Biljana Plavski's guilty plea before the ICTY. So this is when people were convicted on war crimes committed against the Muslims. And this is, her words are very interesting. She says that I highlighted it in red to emphasize the point she's making here. At the time, I easily convinced myself that this was a matter of survival and self-defense. In fact, it was more. Our leadership, of which I was a necessary part, led an effort which victimized countless innocent people. Explanations of self-defense and survival often a justification. By the end, it was said, even among our own people, that in this war we had lost our nobility of character. Of course it would happen. The obvious questions become, if this truth is now self-evident, why did I not see it earlier? What's what happens? So when people are in the frenzy of violence and murder, in the frenzy of propaganda, in the frenzy of caricaturizing of others and othering people and dehumanizing, they can't see. You can't see yourself. Right? Islam is always telling us to step back and stop, patiently reflect and think about yourself. But you can't see that happening. And the worst I've read, in fact, of this, in fact, is from the genocide of Rwanda, 1994. And I would encourage you to read, because in the book on Being Human, which is available for free download from Sapiens Institute website, I have a very lengthy chapter on that genocide. And I have a lot of reports from the mouths, from the words of the perpetrators who did the evil and the killing, explaining the psychology, their own psychology of why they did it. And you'd find similarity, in fact, with what she's saying over here, right? If this truth is now so evident, why did I not see it earlier? And how could our leaders and those who followed have committed such acts? The answer to both questions is, I believe, fear. A blinding fear that led to an obsession. Fear. Irrational fear of the other. Irrational fear of the other. Especially for those of us who, for whom the Second World War was a living memory, that Serbs would never again allow themselves to become victims. In this, we in the leadership violated the most basic duty of every human being, the duty to restrain ourselves, to restrain oneself, and to respect the human dignity of others. Restrain oneself and to respect the human dignity of others. We were committed to do whatever was necessary to prevail. Very interesting words there. All right. So this is now Radovan Karadzic, the perpetrator himself, and the genocide of Bosnia. He says Muslims will disappear, that people will disappear from the face of the earth. Muslims will disappear, that people will disappear from the face of the earth. That's what he says. All right. Now, I want us to think about this over here. Remember that my book here, published by Seb's Institute, called On Being Human, was written because of what happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, in 2019, when Brenton Tarrant committed his act of insane mass killing, violence, terrorism against more than 50 Muslims praying in 2 mosques. The book, in fact, was launched on the first anniversary of that killing in Christchurch in New Zealand. It was launched there. Now, the concept of othering and dehumanization is central to understanding the ideology behind the genocide of Muslims in Bosnia, right? We've learned about that already. So we went therefore from number 1, understanding what happened in those years. Number 2, why they happened. Number 3, what is othering. Number 4, historical examples of that othering. And now we come to understanding that the concept, right, of othering is critical understanding the mindset of the New Zealand mosque gunman Brenton Tarrant. So what's the correlation? What is it? Now, what this guy does is he carries out the Christchurch terror acts, which claimed the lives of 50 Muslims praying at the Al-Nur Mosque and the Linwood Islamic Center in 2019. Now, for him, there existed an entrenched sense of othering of Muslims. He writes a manifesto, and in that manifesto, there is an entrenched sense of othering of Muslims. It's called the Great Replacement. There is much that connects the mastermind of the Bosnian genocide, Radovan Karadzic, and Brenton Tarrant himself, right? So what happens? Radovan Karadzic was infamous in describing Bosnian Muslims as filth, as traitors, and vermin that needed to be, this is a psychology of genocide, the language of genocide, right? The language of dehumanization, calling people cockroaches, vermin, rats, right? So again, it gives this impression of an infestation, of something that needs to be removed. Everybody's is repulsed by those kinds of things. In the words of Biljana Plavčić, Karadzic's deputy, it was Serb genetically deformed material that embraced Islam. All right, so look at that. Now, this, of course, is very interesting because remember that they're denying the Bosnian Muslims as being from Slavic people, same ethnicity as them. And so therefore, the way to do that is to say that since they converted to Islam, it was Serb, their own, because you know that they're Slavic people, obviously. So Serb genetically deformed material, meaning it was the worst of us. It was the rotten of us. It was the filthy and the foul of us that led them to become Muslim. It was the most rotten form or most rotten people from us that ended up becoming Muslims. The deformed of us became Muslim, right? That's what they're saying. Therefore, here, as a way of justifying the fact that they clearly are the same ethnicity as you, they have the same colored skin as you, they have blonde hair like you, they have blue eyes like you, but you have to deny that in order for the othering, therefore, to be to be met, and then therefore the abuse and killing to be meted out against those people. Brenton Tarrant says, this is from his manifesto, Great Replacement. He says, but if you attempt to live in European lands anywhere west of the Bosphorus, we will kill you and drive you roaches from our lands, meaning cockroaches. Therefore, the language is the same. The same language that Karadouic is using, in fact, in the genocide in Bosnia, Tarrant is using here as well, meaning drive you cockroaches, roaches from our lands. Tarrant drew much inspiration from the convicted war criminal Radovan Karadzic. In fact, en route to his killing spree, and of course you probably heard because it was uploaded live for people to watch, Tarrant played a Serbian nationalist song in which Radovan Karadzic is glorified and called on to lead the Serbs. The song further glorifies Serbian fighters and calls for the killing of Turks, who hardline Serb nationalists used to refer to Bosnian Muslims. All right, so to see how it's all being played out here. So the song is glorifying Serbian fighters and calls for the killing of Turks, but obviously they're not Turks. They're actually Slavic people, right? Like the Serbs, like the Croatians, the Bosnians, who hardline Serb nationalists used to refer to Bosnian Muslims. Therefore, you have to create that other. Remember that the way this happens is like this. Every one of us has a mental canvas in our minds. If we are painting on our mental canvases with broad strokes and with wide brushes and with one color, we are disallowing identification. We're disallowing grays. We're disallowing finer grades of distinction. We're disallowing color. We're disallowing identity. All we have is one mesh of one thing, and it's all a characterization. And that's what's happening here. So in the Great Replacement, he describes that the motive for his attack was to create fear, the fear of the other, right? The fear of the other, right? And that's exactly how it works. So when you have out groups created, it's because the in groups are creating these mythological, narratives, caricatures about that out group, the out group, those people, they, them, those ones over there, they do this, they do that. And until people begin to think, well, they're so scared of those others, they are so different to them, they can't ever contemplate ever talking to them because they are over there. Wilfred Owen has an interesting poem, in fact, I remember reading, where he describes himself in a dream, I think it was, where he goes into one of the trenches of the Germans, if I remember, and I think it was, and he describes meeting somebody who went to fight in the war for the same reason as he did, just to make some money or to please his girlfriend, to please his Meg, he says in one other poem. But the idea is therefore that it was the idea of him, because of course he was very anti-war, anti-First War, tragically died in the war, and ironically died in the war. The idea was the way of how do you displace, how does those sentiments of fear building become dissipated through potential empathy that one could have. I mean, that's his idea as far as I understand, from that poem. But that was what he's saying. Therefore, he describes that the motive for his attack was to create fear, the fear of the Muslims, fear of the others, fear of the Turks, and so on and so forth. Now, this last line, in fact, is what he incorporates. This is Brenton Tarrant in The Great Replacement. It says in his book, ask yourselves, what would Pope Urban II do? Now, this I thought was quite interesting, in fact, for Brenton Tarrant to say that, because if he's saying, they ask yourself, so Pope Urban II, of course, is the one that launches the first crusade against the Muslims of Jerusalem, for the Christians to fight them and to take Jerusalem, from the Muslims. But there's just so many things that are, I don't think Brenton Tarrant himself understands even who Pope Urban II was or why he did what he did. There's complexities here. Pope Urban II was a reform pope. Urban II, in fact, was a mentor of or a student of Gregory VII. There's a reformed papacy here. Urban II spent most of his day, in fact, on the day that is called the Crusade, also speaking about Benedictine reform, the monastic order, right? There's in Pope Urban II, in fact, is also calling for the Crusade because there's a schism between the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics, and this is a way for him to assert himself as the leader of the Catholic or Christian world. Urban II, of course, is also fighting against the imperial authorities, because this was the first time that a pope would pronounce a military war against a distant people, as opposed to the emperor doing that. And there's so many complexities happening there. And so I think that this kind of some ignorance, some simplicity in Brenton Tarrant's words in this kind of declarative, ask yourselves, what would Urban II do? But of course, what he's trying to create, Brenton Tarrant, is a sense of fear about the Muslims, that if Urban II were here, he would of course call for a crusade against these people, these Turks today, or Muslims living in Christchurch or New Zealand. They have to be fought against. And of course, when the Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem, the slogan, the call of the day, as they broke into the walls and as they massacred the babies and the children and the women, was Dus vult, which in Latin means God wills it, God wills it. And by the way, in the Spanish Inquisition, Thomas de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor, the call of the day was Dios la quer, which means in Spanish, God wills it, God wills it. So dehumanization, therefore, as a construct of othering, is what? It's the relegating of another to a distant sub-other. It is the seeing in the other much less, and sometimes a complete absence of what one sees in oneself. All this is morally reprehensible, is you find out. Therefore, it's the same as othering, but dehumanizing, therefore, is a worse as a construct, because you're now disallowing, or you're denying, or you're removing from that other the humanity that could have existed, in people's minds, in that other. Therefore, mental canvases, as we said, the humanized other is painted with broad strokes and wide brushes. There are no identifications, no fine lines, no nuances, no grays, and no subtle outlines. The Untermensch versus the Übermensch, right? So the Untermensch were the undermen, the Übermensch were the upper men. So the Nazis therefore castigated the Jews, the Gypsies, the mentally handicapped, as the Untermensch, as the undermen, as the submen, as a subhuman people, as those who are the unworthy, who are not strong enough, not fit enough, not mentally able enough, not white enough, not Aryan enough, not blonde enough, as the Übermensch. And the Übermensch were the upper men, the Aryan race, the superior race, right? And so therefore, the delineating of these boundaries between people are what creates this sense of othering that stretches so far. If it's unchecked, when situations arise, this can easily, as it does, lead to acts of mass violence, mass murder, and human genocide as well. So we spoke about that already. Therefore, giving people the animalistic kind of tendencies, or using using words that are not simply demeaning, but are castigating of others as being unhuman, less human, non-human, more animal-like, rats, vermin, beasts, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, for that to exist, there has to be a moral disengagement. What does that mean? That means that every one of us and all people have this sense of a moral thing. Allah's created, of course, everyone with the Fitra. Well, Fitra is that pure, inherent nature, right? A primordial state of man where he can recognize good and evil. Allah in the Quran says, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. And Allah says, and consider the self, how it can be inspired with such depravity and evil, but also such goodness and piety, right? But moral disengagement means, therefore, that you would disengage yourself from all of these morals currents that should and could and would prevent you from showing such evil towards a person and harming another person, meaning these are things that should hold you back from that, because naturally speaking, it's not in our tendencies, human tendencies, to dehumanize anybody. You know, we have too much goodness that Allah creates in us that's holding us back from that. You know, we can see other people in ourselves, but when these currents become so popular in society, or with the in groups, and the propaganda is there, you know, and the in group becomes entrenched, the out group becomes, you know, kind of an othered entity, then of course these things can of course happen. Now, what is kind of the way that we respond to this? I've incorporated this. I have a new book, which in fact just in fact came out today. The book is called Navigating War, Dissent, and Empathy in Arab-US Relations, Seeing Our Others in Darkened Space. I understand we need to finish them because of Maghrib time now, inshallah. We're nearly done, inshallah. And this quote that I have is from a lady that I have very blessed to have come to know, and in fact now in America, New York, and now our paths crossed, and I've used her photographs in my book. Remarkable lady, E.O. Stubblefield, her name is, and I've used this in fact from one of her shows called No Time for Beauty, which they all focus on the war in Iraq, and I've highlighted some things for us to appreciate. There was a particular picture of a very old man, made me think of a grandfather, and he was holding a young girl that was about the age of my granddaughter. Look at that, right? Made me think of a grandfather, and the girl was about the age of my granddaughter. And he was lifting her up, and her legs were dangling from her body. She was dead, and somehow I just transported into his body and became him. The young girl that he was holding became my granddaughter. That moment, something fervently got into my body that this is so wrong. This can't be done, and nobody is seeing actually who's being killed and the numbers that are being killed. The power of empathic responsiveness. I feel your pain, right? That we are, there's just, that's it. People have granddaughters, simply put, you know, and all people have granddaughters. I mean, simply put, that's the idea. Therefore, the Quranic paradigm is this, that the Quran teaches us to undercut and offset binary distinctions fueled by hate, right? These are just temporary. These are temporary, right? These are temporary, superficial, right? Allah in the Quran says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِ, and from the signs of Allah is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the differences, diversity of your languages and your colors. And these truly are signs in this for those who know. There truly are signs in this for those who know. Diversity of your languages and your colors, not for us to harbor enmity and hostility to one another because of these, no, but simply to use these and think about the amazing creation of Allah, that Allah created us with these variations. The other verse here now, O people, we created you from a single male and a single woman, and made you into races and tribes so that you should recognize one another. In Allah's eyes, in God's eyes, the most honored of you are the ones most mindful of Him. Right? So therefore, a person's dignity is not on account of his ethnicity. A person's dignity is not because of the color of his skin, where he's born, where he's coming from. No. None of these things, in fact, are representation of his human dignity, but rather his connection or understanding of himself, of God, of doing acts of goodness, of believing the right thing. All of these things, in fact, are what Allah is concerned with here. The most honored of you are the ones most mindful of Him. And Allah, God is all aware, and God is all knowing and all aware. And then number two, of course, God, man, and the pursuit of human dignity. All people aspire for human dignity. And Allah in the Quran says from the very beginning, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, we have certainly honored, ennobled the sons of Adam. So even if people are not afforded dignity by other people, Allah has afforded them dignity. even if you're not affording somebody you dignity, Allah has given that person dignity just simply because he is a son of Adam, because Allah created him as a son of Adam. Right? So think about that. You know? And then lastly, we have again the Quranic paradigm, principles of justice to counter in-group biases, impediments of love and hate. You could love somebody so much it could prevent you from seeing the wrong he's doing and the injustice he's committing against somebody else. the verse in the Quran here, number one is Laysu sawa, they're not all the same. No people are all the same. No two people are the same. Everybody's different. And number two, again, the verse with ennobled sons of Adam, the key verses here about the impediments of love and hate are these that Allah in the Quran says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, be upright, for justice as witnesses to Allah, even if it's against yourselves or against the ones that, or against your parents, whether they're rich or poor, or your near of kin. Meaning, Allah, don't let the impediment of love prevent you from being just towards people. And number two, the other similar verse, O you who believe, be upright towards, for Allah as witnesses to justice, and never let the hatred you have for people swerve you from being just. I'dilu huwa aqrabu littaqwa, be just, and that is closer to piety. So this is the impediment of hatred. So neither the impediment of love or the impediment of hatred should have a place, right? Meaning be upright for the sake of Allah. And lastly, between bystanding versus rescuing, right? In all human genocides, there's groups of people that emerge: bystanders, perpetrators, victims, bystanders, and rescuers. We got to be of the rescuers, right? Allah, and this is the hadith, the Prophet says, beware of injustice. Injustice will appear as darkness on the day of judgment. Fair avarice, it destroyed those before you and caused them to shed another's blood and to make lawful what was unlawful, right? So zulm, any harm meted out against people, right? Genocide, of course, is the worst form of all of it. But any injustice, you could see, I mean, that's for anyone, in schools, in your workplace, in society, in the streets, anybody being harmed. It's your responsibility to do something to prevent that harm taking place. Not to be the bystander, not to be the one who is indifferent, the one who is complicit, the one who's simply looking and watching as a spectator. No, but to be the one who is physically, actively helping, verbally. The Prophet said, if you've seen evil, change it with your hands. If you can't, with your mouths. If you can't, hate it in your heart. That's the weakest of faith. Try your best to do something. So therefore, and then of course the last thing here is about, it's a beautiful lesson, Surah Al-Buruj in the Quran, the constellations, where you have this taking place because you have a mass murder, right? And Allah is describing in that surah when He says, subhanahu wa ta'ala, that when the people had dug a trench and they're burning these believers alive, and Allah speaks about those who were bystanders and those who were active as well, idhum alayha qu'ud. And Allah says when they're over the fire, but the scholars, they say they can't simply be over the fire, but they were so close to the fire that they were enjoying the roasting of human skin. They were enjoying seeing evil committed against other people. Never ever become desensitized to that, by these kinds of things. Always remember the great loss of life, the great loss of dignity, the great loss of a life. Allah in the Quran says, whoever saves a life, it's like he saved all humanity's life. Whoever takes a life, it's like he's taken everyone's life. I mean, that just shows how consequential it is in one single human life. That life had a name, that life had a parent, that life had maybe a child, that life had a memory, that life had a legacy, that life had dreams and aspirations, all just the same as you. Right, so therefore these are huge things to talk about. These are huge things for us to remember. These are huge things happen in human history that should never have happened, but they've happened for us to learn a lesson. Therefore, that we would not want these things happening ever again. And we've come now to the end, and I think it's appropriate because it's time for Maghrib now, inshallah. I want to thank all of you for your attendance, inshallah, and Jazakallah khair for listening patiently. May Allah bless all of you. Please follow our work, inshallah, on sapiensinstitute.org website. And I look forward, inshallah, to engaging, inshallah, with you, and inshallah, at another time. May Allah bless all of you. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.